Hi, this is Megan with Beadaholique, and today I'm going to show you how to use the Rix Beading Loom. And this is what the loom looks like, and it is a little different from a traditional beading loom. The regular beading loom would leave you with all of your warp threads hanging off the ends, in which case usually you need to back loom weaving pieces, but this beading loom only leaves you with 2 warp threads at the end, so it's a lot less bulky and a lot more possible to use the loom woven piece without putting a back on it. The loom does come with a user's guide that has instructions in it, but I'm going to show you in the video how to do it, just in case that's an easier way for you to follow. Your loom will come with 4 of these warp pegs that have a little split in them. One of them is a spare, so you'll use 3, and it will come with 3 warp rods, and one of those is a spare also. So your warp rods in the storage position sit on these magnets here. The first thing you're going to want to do is pull off one of the little plastic ends and slide it through these little loops here and here on the stalks. And the other thing that comes with your loom is your warp separator card. And this is just a laminated card. If you lose it or it stops having a nice edge to it, you can just use a playing card or business card cut in half. So to do loom bead weaving, you'll need some seed beads. And a Delica is going to give you a really nice, even, flat, uniform looking piece of bead weaving, because they have a much more uniform size and shape. I'm using a 10-0 size Delica. This is a little easier to get the hang of with a larger bead than a smaller bead, and it's also a little easier to do with a narrower strip to start with. And then I just have nylon beading thread that I'm going to use. And I have a size 10 beading needle and some scissors. So one of the things that's different about the Rix beading loom is that you need to determine the length of your piece before you start. And you'll move the little wing nuts in order to adjust the position of this piece here. I'm not going to do a very large piece because I'm just doing it to demonstrate use, so I'm going to move mine down quite a bit. But what you're going to want to do is measure from rod to rod and include the rod in your measurement. So I only need a few inches in order to demonstrate. So I'm going to move mine in pretty close. And then just tighten up both of those wing nuts to make your stock nice and sturdy there. Now pull out the warp pegs. Take your beading thread, leave it on the spool, give yourself about an 8-inch tail, and slide your thread into the slit in the warp peg. Then go around the peg a couple of times and bring your thread back through. And then place the peg into the second slot, the second little hole there. Okay. Now you're going to take your spool of thread and leave it on the spool. You don't want to cut it unless your spool is too big to fit through the openings here. Go over the warp rods, pass underneath, and pull back around. Now anytime you're doing bead weaving on a loom, you need your warp threads, and then when you weave across, those are your weft threads. Your warp threads, you will need 1 more thread than the number of beads you want in the row. And every pass back and forth, each pass is going to give you 1 thread, so make sure that you're counting back and forth and not just the full pass, but each direction. And you want to keep the tension on this thread that you're pulling pretty snug. Don't bend the warp rods out of shape, but keep it tight. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and I'm just going to do a piece that's 8 beads wide just to demonstrate. So I'm going to go ahead and finish with 9. Now when you do your last pass, you want to make sure that you are headed over the warp rod. So if, for example, you were going to have a different number and you were going to end on this side, instead of going under, you'd pull this last piece over because you need to have the tension to pull it down. But mine is going to end on this end instead because I'm doing an even number of beads. So mine will already be going over. Go ahead and give yourself a nice sufficient tail of thread. Take another warp peg, measure out kind of where it's going to go into the hole. Then slide your thread into the slit in the warp peg, around and back through. And then go ahead and push the peg into the hole. And if you were on this end, you just push it into the corresponding hole here. And then you're going to tighten that up just like you would a guitar string, if you're familiar with that. You're just going to twist on the peg until you have a nice tension. Now if you can even out the spacing on your threads, it's going to make the first couple rows a little easier to complete. So just kind of space them out somewhat close to the size they're going to want to be and nice and even. Okay. Make sure those warp pegs are secure, and the next thing we're going to do is take the warp separator and you're going to go over, under, through each thread, and make sure you go in the right order as they're wrapped around. Don't get them twisted or crossed. And then pull the warp separator card all the way down to the bottom warp rod there. And there's my thread. Then you're going to take a new length of thread and get a length that's about as long as you're comfortable working with. You'll need to tie off and add a new thread as you run out, and you would do that just the same way as you would with off loom weaving. And we do have a video how to tie off and add new thread in bead weaving if you're not familiar with that process. So thread your needle and then take about a 6-inch to 8-inch tail, and again you're going to go into the slit on that last warp peg, wrap around a couple times and back the other way through the slit. And now we're going to go into the first hole here. And now pick up the number of beads that you've decided will be in each row for your project. Bring your needle from left to right under your warp threads and pull the beads down, not all the way, just about half to 2/3 of the way down your thread. You can put your needle on the handy little magnet here to keep it out of the way. For the very first row, you're going to bring your thread up over the warp separator, and you want your beads pulled down to rest right on top of the warp separator. Okay, now you're going to use your you're going to use your finger to hold the beads in place, and then arrange your warp threads so that there is one thread to either side of each bead. And you do need to move them around and make sure that your threads are all in order and there's not two between a bead. just like that. Each bead has a thread to either side, including on the outside. Don't let them double up. Be careful, they move around really pretty easily at the very beginning. The beginning is way harder than the rest. So if you can get the hang of it in the beginning, you'll be fine. Okay, then we're going to pass our needle back through from right to left over the warp threads. In the user manual, he does suggest using the needle eye first. You can go point first or eye first. It's a little easier to go above the warp threads and not hit the warp thread if you use the eye first. Just be careful because that means that the end in your hand is sharp. You don't want to poke yourself with it. So you just take the eye of the needle and angle it upwards towards you a little bit as you go back through to make sure that you're going up on top of the warp threads, and then pull all the way through. Now if you went underneath any of the warp threads accidentally, you'll have a bead fall out. So you'll need to go back and pull the thread and start again. So that's the first row. Go ahead and pull that tight. And we're going to do one more row before we remove the warp separator. So you'll just get your designated number of beads on the needle. Pull it down a little bit. Bring the needle from the left to the right under the warp threads. And then pull it down. And use your finger to push the beads up through the warp threads. Once you get the beads in their spot, which is much easier after the first row, then you're going to get your needle and you're going to go back through the beads from right to left on top of the warp threads. So you can decide if you're more comfortable using the needle eye first or point first. And then pull that tight. Now you're going to pull the warp separator card out. And then just take your first two rows and push them all the way down against the warp rod. And then pull to pull up the slack on your weft thread. And just push them all the way. You don't want any extra space here. And then you're just going to continue doing rows in the same manner. Pull your beads down. Bring your needle underneath from left to right. Use your finger to push the beads up through the warp threads, with one to either side of each bead. And then bring your needle back over the warp threads from right to left and pull tight. And you're going to continue doing rows until you've filled the entire warp thread and you're ending right as close to this warp rod as possible here. So once you've done your loom, weaving all the way up to the top, we're going to go ahead and try to fit as many rows as you can all the way up to the warp rod there. And I've pushed mine down pretty tight. You don't want to rumple it, but you are going to absorb the excess thread that goes over the warp rods. So if it's pretty tight beforehand, it's going to be less loose later, is the way that I look at it. So I'm gonna do just my last row. And it can be a little tricky to do the last row or two, just like the first ones can be a little tricky, just because of the way that the warp threads go over and under the rod there. I actually find that sometimes it's easiest to do this a few beads at a time. push that bead up through, even though you have those threads going around this way. So it's a little tricky. This is another thing that's harder to do with a smaller bead. So I do suggest practicing with like a 10-0 before you try an 11. Okay, and now you can see that I'm using up all the space. I go all the way from one warp rod to the next. You want to leave as little extra space there as possible. Okay, and I'm just going to go back through and tie off. And you can decide how you're going to attach this, how you're going to finish it, what you're going to do with it, whether or not you want to tie off before, or if you're going to need that end thread there. I'm just going to tie off to get this thread out of my way, since I'm just showing you how to use the loom. And again, you would just tie off the same way as you do when you're doing off loom weaving. Just tie a knot and then weave through some extra beads. Okay, now I'm going to remove the warp pegs. And pull the thread off. And then remove the warp rods. And when you slide this out, I'm actually going to slide it right out of my beadwork. Now, if you've done loom weaving on a traditional bead loom, then you know that now, usually, you have lots and lots of warp threads hanging loose all over the place. So, as you can see, what we have here is just a little loop at the end instead. So what you're going to do is just gently shift and spread the beads. Just pull it through your fingers. And you're going to just take up that excess. And you want to make sure you don't have any big gaps anywhere. This is one of the reasons why if you pulled it tighter while it was on the loom, it's going to work a little better now, because you've got a little bit more room for those beads to fill in. And so this is the end of the beginning of my weft thread. So I'm going to tie that off, and then you only have 2 warp threads to tie off and weave in. And you can use those threads to connect findings or a clasp, or you can just weave them in and have a nice freestanding piece. So it's much, much easier to use your loom piece off of the Rix loom without having to back it the way you traditionally would for a regular loom.